Okay. Welcome to another episode of Grain Farmers GrainTALK webinar. Today we're going to be talking about cover crops and clover in particular. And we have the privilege of having Verhallen with us today. And Anne, it's a great privilege to have you with us. I understand you're the soil management specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, but you're also the editor of the Cover Crop Best Management Practices Guide. As well, you're the Ontario coordinator for the Midwest Cover Crop Council tool, the online tool. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. But today's topic is going to be about clover and some options that farmers may want to think about as they evaluate their clover stands for their cover crop and what they can do if they need to touch it up or replace it or do something with it. And maybe you have some other advice for some of those guys using clover, or why they should or why they shouldn't be using clover.
Yep, thanks, Marty. I'm really pleased to be here. It's a new experience working with this particular venue, so we'll see how it goes. It's August. It's a wonderful time to do cover crops. It's time that we can evaluate whether the clover made it through or not. I know coming through to harvest of wheat, it was a little iffy on some of those fields, but certainly now after most of the province has had some rain, we can take a good strong look at it and see whether there's some things we should be doing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about clovers, just to start, because we know from the work that's been done by Bill Dean and Dr. David Hooker here at Ridgetown that having clover and wheat in a rotation is really the key. And I know you've had both of them on various webinars for GFO in the past, talking about rotations and talking about the importance of including clover in a rotation. But I always get questions every year about single versus double cut. What's the difference? I've had the occasional time where fellows called me saying, I paid for double, but I think I got single. How can I tell the difference? And then also, if you start looking at any of the material coming out of the US, they use a totally different terminology than what we use. So when we're talking red clover, we're usually talking single versus double cut. So the Americans call double cut medium, whereas single cut is called mammoth. I can never keep those straight. We've got a nice little postcard that the ministry has put out that gives you all those kinds of details. But the key difference is double cut red clover flowers in the seeding year. So this is the clover that we'll see flowering in late fall. Whereas single cut requires vernalization. It requires a cold treatment to actually come into flower. The other difference is kind of the growth, and that has a part to play when you're thinking about what clover you want to use as a frost seed in wheat in the spring. So traditionally we've used double cut red clover because it's got vigorous growth. We get a lot of growth really quickly once the wheat has been harvested. More recently, because of weather situations or short straw or things like that, there's been concerns some years about double cut red clover just growing too tall and starting to get clipped by the combine and causing some issues. So there's been a number of growers who have gone to either just using single cut or using a combination of double and single cut clovers. The reason for a single cut choice would be it's slower growth and you aren't going to get as much height. The other piece is it's a little bit more drought tolerant. And I think in Ontario, we have some real challenges getting clover to establish. We often get a good establishment and then we'll have a dry May or June or a brutally hot and dry July like this year was. And we'll start losing our clovers then. So we're going to talk about a little bit about assessing your clover stand. And then we'll talk about some other clovers that are actually, I think we'll talk about the other clovers first. Yes. Okay. So let's just take a little bit closer look. Looking at the red clover, single versus double, you really can't tell any difference when they're growing in the field. Here's some clover I seeded this spring in my cover crop garden. The bottom one is single cut. The top one in that small square is double cut. They really don't look any different. They're a clover until they start to come into flower. There's some slight differences sometimes you will see with the roots, but they're both a fibrous taproot. So you can see the picture on the right-hand side that gives an example of single cut versus double cut versus a crimson clover, which we'll talk about a little bit later. These plants have all been growing for a couple of months without anything over top of them. So they were not frost seeded, they were single seeded by themselves in the springtime. So, but this gives you a good comparison of what kind of growth you could expect probably by early September if you've got a decent stand. And you can see that we do have that taproot, fibrous taproot system that's going to do a really good job of building soil aggregates and starting to break up some surface compaction if there's anything that's close to the surface.
So, Ann, if that wasn't a wheat field, would you think there'd be any difference between the double cut or single cut? Because as you mentioned, there'd be a big height difference for guys combine. I've seen that before. I've seen a field split half and half single cut, half double. And a lot of people said, well, the single cut gives you a bigger taproot. There's more growth underground. And I've dug the plants up. And exactly what you said, I didn't see any difference between the root mass themselves, but it was all about top growth with the double cut is what was really different about them.
And that's true. And that's really what we see is top growth is different. Sometimes you'll pick up some differences with the roots. It's pretty minor. I think it's the root system similar enough. I wouldn't get upset about the small differences in root system. I think the choice is made more on your history of whether you've got issues with too much growth at harvest and the clover starting to come through your crop canopy and interfering with the combine. Okay. So one of the other options, or another clover that's become popular in more recent years, is called crimson clover. The thing with this, and it's a gorgeous clover, it's absolutely brilliant in its color, it's very pretty, but it cannot be used like we use a red clover. You cannot frost seed it. It's a winter annual. It's going to try and reproduce. It will try and flower as quickly as possible. As you can see by the number of seeds per pound, it's a slightly larger seed. You don't want to frost seed it, but we can use it for patching in red clover seedings after wheat harvest. And it'll get some pretty decent growth on it. So if you're looking at the picture of my hand there holding that clover that was seeded after wheat was off. And that was the growth in early November. And that particular field was near Stayner, Ontario. So a little bit cooler than down here, but they still got some really nice growth on it.
So Ann, if a grower was going to go and patch in on its wheat stubble, what do you recommend for how they seed it? Do you need a special type of clover seeder or just a bulk spread and spread it on the field?
That is going to be one of those things that's really dependent on what kind of conditions we've got. I'd much rather see them take a drill and get out there, because the other consideration is how tight did you cut the straw? Did you remove the straw? How well did you spread the chaff? So I'd rather see I know it's a lot of messing around, but I'd rather see somebody go in there with a drill and just drop it wherever you're really concerned that you've got a low stand. You're going to get faster emergence. You're going to even out your stand as best you can. If you just broadcast it this time of year, we're really at the mercy of the weather. If it's sitting up on top of some straw, we might get a rainy day and then it dries out again. So it's going to slow establishment. And truthfully, if you're going to the effort of patching a stand of red clover, let's do it right so that we're going to have as consistent a stand of clover as possible and a little more consistency in being able to predict the nitrogen needs for the next crop.
Seed to soil contact, always important.
Always. You cannot forget the agronomy part of cover crops. Yeah. They're plants. They are a crop. And we often think that we can just throw them on the ground and they'll grow. And yeah, things like oats will. But if you really want to get the most out of your investment, because this is costing you money, treat it like a crop and pay attention to the agronomics. So another one that I do know a few growers will mix this in with their red clover is yellow sweet clover. And often you'll see this on roadsides. It can be an annual or a biennial. You can see that it's got a really tiny seed. We get a lot more seeds per pound, but it's got this wonderful taproot, which will break up compaction. The only problem with that is that you've got to leave it grow to get that real taproot going. So you're looking at leaving that clover down for the better part of a year to get the most benefit out of it. And one that I often get asked about is Dutch white clover or white clover. It's something that can be frost seeded. It's a really tiny seed. But the problem with white clover, it's very non-competitive. We usually have it in horticultural applications between beds or underneath vines, or it's often shows up in grazing lands, like in pasture lands and things like that. It's not very aggressive. All the clovers have an issue if we're trying to plant them in August, because none of them grow very quickly and they're very non-competitive. But white clover probably is the worst for being non-competitive. And there's a few newer clovers, and I often get asked questions about, is it worth it to try this berseem? Berseem often, this is a really nice looking berseem plant. Often it looks to me more like a single stalk of alfalfa. You often see it put into a cover crop mixture in order to expand the number of legumes. It is pretty drought resistant. And in fact, in years where I've had different cover crop plantings where we established it earlier in the summer, often this berseem clover is one of the ones that will keep growing even through some very dry conditions. Is it worth it? Well, we know that we can get good stands with red clover, and it's often much cheaper. All depends. You check and see what you can get it for. And one of the newer ones is this balança. The jury's out on balança. It's just starting to be studied. I know it's available. I know it's in some mixtures. We're a little concerned about how much overwintering ability it has, because it hasn't overwintered so far very well in any of the plots that I've talked to people about. So stay tuned. We'll hopefully have a bit more information on balança, but it is one of the new ones that are being touted as a different clover to be used.
And I noticed that root system on the balança looks a little bit different than the others, not that tap root like I've seen with the other clovers. Can you describe more about that?
It is a different, it's amazing with clovers. They're all clover, but they seem to have some very different root systems. And so, yeah, what you're seeing here in the balança is a much more fibrous system. I don't see as much of evidence of a tap root. But then again, when you look at sweet clover versus red clover, there's a difference. And then again, look at the white clover. I didn't show you the root system for the white clover, but it's interesting because white clover is a spreader. So it has more of a stolon system. It's got a root system underneath it, but then the stems will actually go out and root, and it's a spreading clover. Whereas most of these are more like a bunching clover. They're going to be just over where that root system is. So I'm still learning a lot about this balança. It's one of the things I have in an observation in my cover crop garden this summer.
It's good to have options.
Okay, so with clover stands, we often get to the point where the wheat has come off and we're looking at a bare field, especially this year. There was a lot of fields where you just looked at and thought, I put clover on there, where did it go? I saw it in the spring and it's gone. So let's take a look at what we need to do when we're assessing clover stands. Everybody would love to have a stand like this. This is from a few years back. The grower asked me out to actually see this field. He was so thrilled with it. Absolutely over the moon. This was a wonderful stand of clover. But this grower has a known history of seeding early, always having red clover, and having a very on-the-ball tight crop rotation of corn, soybeans, and wheat that always had red clover. So I think he also has soil that's primed for red clover.
And I was going to say a rainfall in June helps as well.
Well, that's where we're getting to. So give me a second. That one was from a few years ago. This is from this year. And this is actually a field where we were taking the straw off at home. It's not my field. It's a friend of ours. Anyways, it's lighter soil. It happens to be north of the river. It caught some of those June rains. They're really on the ball with early seeding and a fairly heavy seeding rate. And you can see they've got a lovely stand of clover that now that we've got the rain, I haven't gone back to check, but I fully expect to see that field totally green shortly. And then in contrast, so that's a light textured soil. Here's a little bit heavier textured soil. This is some information that Ryan Benjamin's shared with me. So here's a field with wheat where it was over 100 bushel. And I often hear guys say, I get more than 100 bushel, I can't get clover. Well, or I have heavy clay, I can't get clover. Well, here's proof that you can. There's a few things going on here. So 7 pounds per acre of seed, that was broadcast mid-March, so it had lots of time to get established. It is no-till wheat, but in this case, in the rotation, there's tillage after the corn, so it's not a full no-till system, and fairly careful with his herbicides, as far as not trying to endeavor to not harm the clover. And the crucial part, he caught some rain on this field in June. And that this year seems to really be the big factor. But here's some things to think about. Our goal for a stand of clover is 3 to 4 plants per square foot. That's not a lot. And especially, think back, if you're putting on the recommended 7 to 9 pounds, and I even know guys who put less than that if they've had good success with clover. That means that you've got somewhere between 44 to 56 seeds per square foot of clover that you spread. We have tremendous loss of clover. So to achieve 3 to 4 plants, you think it wouldn't be that hard. But that's what we're aiming for. Now, clover stands often end up being hard to judge because they're not consistent. Because I'm saying the goal is a uniform stand of 3 to 4 plants per square foot. Well, often we have a good stand, but it's thin in spots. So what can we do? Well, that's a place where some of these other clovers can start to play a part. We can overseed those bare or thin spots with a clover like Crimson. Now, if you're putting manure on that field, I actually think about something else that would scavenge nitrogen a little bit better. Not to say that the legumes won't, they will. They'll still scavenge nitrogen, about 80% as effective as anything else. But things like oats, radish, and other nitrogen scavenging crops, so any of the grasses, will do a better job. So we can have a patchy stand where there's holes, or we can have a really thin and patchy stand where it's just really not there if the stand isn't complete. So you can overseed. The other option is take a look at some of the spring cereals or the winter cereals or cover crop mixtures. So you can see in the background, what I've got here is later on in the season where it was an oat, radish, and I believe there was a little bit of clover in that too. This does a great job for helping to keep the humidity up in that wheat straw. So it helps to break it down. So it's going to cycle better. We're going to build some better soil aggregation, and all those things will die over winter, making the next year's planting job a whole lot easier. The other thing to consider, and I realize at this point it's too late to do anything about it, but think about it for the coming year. Spreading straw and chaff is really important for the cover crop establishment. Any place, and some of these big combines, it really becomes a challenge to get that material spread the full width of what the header was, especially the chaff. And this will play a part in your cover crop establishment and growth, whether it's the red clover that was frost seeded or something that you're coming back with later. And you can see the nitrogen tie up and the retarded growth of the cover crop in this field picture. So some other cover crop options. Well, any of the winter cereals, things like rye. This is some summer seeded rye. Rye requires vernalization. So until it's had that cold treatment, it's not going to go to head. It will just sit there and thicken up. So you can plant it anytime if it's going to be a cover crop. Coming back with some wheat is a possibility. There's also triticale, which of course is that combination of rye and wheat. It's often a little bit more expensive. Now, often I'll get the question, so I don't have much of a cover crop, but my volunteer wheat will do the drip, right? Maybe, maybe not. And when we're looking for that cover crop to help us as one of our tools in our toolbox to suppress herbicide-resistant weeds, we need to make sure that we've got a consistent, strong stand of a cover crop all the way across the field. This is some older work that Adam Hayes and I did as part of a soil and crop project, where we had different cover crop mixes that were seeded after wheat, and then we also had a bare strip where we just let whatever volunteer wheat was going to come and the weeds as a comparison. And you can see that we've got quite a few differences in winter wheat volunteer establishment, really depended on the combine and the combine operator and whether there was a little bit of tillage. The challenge is these volunteer wheat stands are not consistent, and we just don't seem to get the growth out of them. I'm not really sure why we don't get the growth out of them, because if we planted the wheat instead, it seems to grow better. And then probably actually because we've got the smaller seeds that we're trying to blow out, especially in a high fusarium year. And then we've also got all those weeds because the weeds are starting at the same time. So if you're going for winter wheat as your option to give you a cover crop on that field, it's a good idea to actively seed something, not just to depend on the volunteer to come along. So some other options. I love the spring cereals because they're out of the ground really quickly. You can see that we've got some oats and barley and actually triticale here. They come up quickly, they cover the ground quickly, and in the case of spring cereals, they die over the winter, so you're not dealing with a lot of residue. It's amazing how much growth you can get on an oat cover crop. It'll look really intimidating in the fall. By springtime, after we've had snow and a bit of breakdown, there really isn't a whole lot left. That said, you need to be kind of careful about your seeding rate. If you're just going for a cover crop, we're going for a light seeding rate of a spring cereal. If you're going for a forage, then of course you're looking at forage seeding rates, and that's entirely different. Pretty much double the seeding rate. And one of the other ones that's gained a lot of popularity, and it can be used by itself, but I actually prefer to see it in a mix, is radish. There's lots of varieties out there, or named varieties, whether it's tillage radish or nitro or any of those other ones. You can expect to see some flea beetle feeding, as you can see in the seedling at the top. It will keep growing well into probably usually about Christmas time. We'll have it with some snow. And then by springtime, you're looking at the upper left picture where it's punky, broken down, and dried out. And essentially, you have very little protection for that soil and nothing to interfere with seeding, which is why I like to see it in a mixture. So some oats or barley or rye mixed in with the radish, then we've got the best of both worlds. This one I approach with some hesitation. I love buckwheat, but it has to have the right fit. Now, it has a fit after wheat harvest down here because we've got 6 or 8 weeks of warm weather still that's going to be frost free when you look at the Southwest. There are people who will double crop buckwheat and take it to grain after winter wheat harvest, and that's always possible. What I love about buckwheat, beyond its supporting pollinators, is take a look at that root system that's on the right-hand side. It's really hard to see the root system because it's massive and it's fragile, but it does a wonderful job of building aggregation. The challenge is it will set seed, and it's going to flower within 4 to 5 weeks. It'll be setting viable seed by 6 weeks, and that may or may not be a problem. Buckwheat by itself in a seeding is manageable. Buckwheat in a mixture becomes a little bit more problematic because it's going to try and set seed, and everything else will be growing along quite happily, and you're not wanting to destroy it, but it's going to set seed, and that seed will germinate next year. All depends on what your herbicide program and how you manage the next crop. May not be a big problem, but if you're trying to do it with just a burn-off type program, probably not going to work too well.
So, Ann, with buckwheat, then, if you seed it later, how late do you have to seed it that it doesn't go to seed on you?
Again, it's going to hit viable seed within about 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
The challenge is you can't leave it too late because it's a warm season type of plant, and the first sniff of frost will take it out.
Okay.
So that first frost, that first really cold, frosty day that we often see in September or early October, it'll be done. So it's not something you can seed at the beginning of September. It doesn't like cold weather. If you seeded it now, it's something that you're probably going to want to destroy by about the 3rd week of September.
And will it have a root system like that by the 3rd week of September before it flowers?
At 6 or 8 weeks, it'll have a root system like that. Now, that is a root system that developed on a sandier soil type, so I wouldn't expect to, you'd be hard pressed to find that root system on a clay soil just because it's so fine and fragile. But it's going to do a really nice job of building aggregates, and it'll do a pretty decent job of suppressing weeds because it is aggressive. It's got the kind of root, it's got the kind of leaf arrangement that it does a really good job of shading the ground quickly.
So Ann, you mentioned about oats and seeding oats and the difference between, seeding rates depending on what you want to do with the oats. But if a grower just wanted to seed some oats in now to get a cover crop, you said go with a lower rate. What would your recommended rate be for a cover crop?
Okay, so if you're just doing a cover crop of oats, just for ground cover, for erosion protection, just to keep the ground covered, just to build some aggregation, I would be looking at usually 35, 40, maybe 45 pounds, no more than that, per acre. If you're going to a forage, you're pretty much double that.
Okay, so 45 pounds, that's just a little bit more than a bushel then, right?
Yeah, you're pretty much less, around a bushel or a little bit less.
Okay.
And if you're going to do a mix, say oat and radish mix, usually my recommendation is 30, 35 pounds of oats and 2 pounds of radish. Any more than 2 or 3 pounds of radish, the radish, if there's enough residual nitrogen, will take over the mix and tend to suppress the oats.
Yeah, it's pretty small seed. That's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, you get a lot of plants out of those seeds, and they have a very aggressive ability to grow, and they do shade out the oats quite quickly.
That quick, eh? Wow.
Yeah. So the thing with a cover crop that you're planting now is to be a little bit patient. It's going to look tiny and insignificant. Here is a large cover crop mix seeded in early August, and this is about the 3rd week of August. And you can see that they've emerged, they're getting going. This is on a heavier clay soil. You have to be a bit patient because it takes time. And with time, you can have the whole field covered. And the fascinating thing with mixes is that we do get a change in that cover crop. What expresses itself early on, especially if you've got a mix that has, say, some warm season grasses in it, or buckwheat or sunflowers, once we have a frost, all those things will die and start to move backward, whereas the cool season things, peas or hairy vetch or rye, some of those things will start to move more to the fore. But either way, if you seed a cover crop in August, by November, we should have some really nice cover that'll provide excellent protection, good weed suppression, and build some soil structure. Okay, so as we're coming into harvest season, it's going to be winter, as hard as that is to believe at this point. It's a great time to go looking for more information. And that's the best thing with cover crops, is looking for more information and looking for local information. Cover crops are very much a regional thing. They respond to different soil types. And of course, in Ontario, we have different weather than the US. So there are places to find some really good cover crop information. Of course, I have to plug OMAFRA's cover crop webpage and the agronomy guide. If you look on fieldcropnews.com, there's quite a bit on any of the more recent projects on cover crops, herbicide work that Darren Robinson has done on plant back with cover crops. The Midwest Cover Crop Council, of course, has a site, and I'll get into that in a second. The other place that you can go for some very up-to-date project work with cover crops is the Soil and Crop Advances reports. So any of the work that's been done on organic no-till soybeans, the work that Adam Hayes and I did on mixes after wheat, all of that is reported and it's available to anybody. You don't have to have a Soil and Crop membership to access these reports. Now, I do want to dive into the Midwest Cover Crop Council decision tool a little bit more. You have access to that too. Ontario is part of the Midwest Cover Crop Council. In fact, we're a little bit unique because we're the only province that is on one of those cover crop councils. And there is a decision tool as part of this. We do have a new and improved version coming soon. This is the older version. We've just gone through a whole process of reviewing all the data, all the information, and updating it. And that hopefully will be out in the next few weeks. But the cool part with this, the really neat part about this decision tool is you can pick Ontario, you can pick Chatham-Kent, or you can pick Middlesex, you can pick Huron. And in the background, we have our own long-term weather data. And then you can set up and look at what your goals for the cover crop are, and it will populate and depopulate the list based on that. And once you've narrowed down your choice of cover crop, you can click on the cover crop itself, and it comes up with a whole spec sheet. Seeding rates, depending on how you're seeding, any concerns of it becoming a weed, what its attributes are. It's all very detailed, usually about 2 pages on each cover crop. That gives you a lot more detail for making good, strong agronomic decisions about your cover crop.
I like that, Ann. A tool that helps you decide what's the best cover crop based on what your needs are. That's awesome.
Well, it is based on a lot of conversations over the years, and usually most of those conversations start with, what do you want out of the cover crop? What's your goal? Where are you going with this? And, you know, getting all those background. What crop are we following? What soil type? Is it drained? Do you ever have any flooding? How much residue can you manage in the springtime? So it captures all those conversations that I typically have when I have a conversation with a farmer about the cover crop and he's calling asking about what cover crop to grow.
Yeah, there's so much selection. It really helps a grower kind of narrow down what you really should be focused on and not put those ones in that could be a mistake for him. That's great.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Ann. This was a great webinar. I greatly appreciate your time and giving us some information, a great conversation on cover crops, especially on clovers and what the value is for us as clovers and how we can fix things up if we need to for the cover crops this year. Thank you very much for your time, Ann. I'm sure everybody loved listening to this conversation.
Thanks for the invitation. It's always great to talk cover crops.